And we're live. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. We are here today with Brenda, who's going to talk to us about challenging stereotypes with our allies. So, Brenda has been in the interactive media game since 1976. So she's a pro and she's a veteran at all of this. Name any company making games, she's been with them, she's made games. Atari, Activision, and Sun Labs. So she knows what she's doing, and she's the trailblazer and a pioneer in talking about women in technology and design and breaking the stereotype about women not getting into gaming or development. And she's written multiple books, and she's multiple award winner designer. And it's an honor to have her here, and she'll be talking to us about uprooting stereotypes through research and allyship. So, without anything else, go ahead, Brenda.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I've been thinking a lot about stereotypes lately. I'll talk later in this quick presentation about working with the IXDA 21 conference on these issues. But let me just start by saying that stereotypes are born of ignorance. They're also born of cultural bias and systemic racism. They can be attempts by the powerful to uphold some hegemonic order. But whatever their source, they hurt all of us. So when we think about uprooting stereotypes, the first thing to notice is that we suck at it. We're not very good at it. We need different methods. We need more commitment, clearer vision to get to the heart of the matter. So one kind of stereotype is the sort that totalizes the audience that we think we're designing for. Another kind of stereotype is who we think we are or should be as designers. So challenging stereotypes means meeting people where they are. My work has involved human-centered qualitative research with diverse populations, including tween girls, little boys, baby boomers, teens, young American adults. And in every case, interviewing at home or in other places has led to surprising results and design innovations. So here's a story from way back in the 20th century, in the mid 1990s, when girls were not using computers very much. I'll take you back to my slide. There we go. I embarked on a research journey to figure out what would engage girls and get them involved with technology. And that led to the founding many years later of a company called Purple Moon. And I want to share some ideas and methods with you that have influenced my work ever since. So yeah, this is ancient history, probably before most of you were born. But the historical context is really important here. In the mid-90s.
Brenda, just a second. We can't see your screen.
Sure. There we go. In the mid-90s, girls were not playing computer games or working with programming. And when I visited my daughter's computer classes in grade school, it looked a lot like this slide. This picture is typical. The boys are avidly engaged in learning to write code, and the girls are sitting in back looking uncomfortable, with the exception of my daughter, Hillary, who ended up writing code for some of the boys, but that's another story. You know, the lack of enthusiasm on the part of most girls was utterly predictable. They had learned, as I had decades earlier, that girls aren't good at math, shouldn't study math, should not mess with technology. So our first goal in conducting our research was to figure out whether or how we could change that. So one key was looking at computer gaming. Now, boys who were used to playing computer games knew that they could just bang on the keyboard fiercely and something would happen and they wouldn't break it. Girls who were not gamers at the time were certainly afraid they'd do something wrong and break it. Don't touch that, you'll break it. You know, many girls internalize that idea themselves. So as researchers, we might have asked, well, why don't girls play computer games? But that question would have led us straight into the void. Games were part of male culture. The games at that time were developed by young men for young men and sold in places where young men shopped. There were no games to match girls' style of play. So we sharpened to our research question to a better one. How do girls and boys play, and how do they play differently? So we conducted massive secondary research, studying everything we could get our hands on. We interviewed about 50 experts in the field, from academics to playground supervisors. We used the results to formulate interview guides and set out to interview over 1,000 kids across the United States. And what we found took us deeply into several questions. How does what we call constructive play differ between boys and girls? How do boys and girls compete differently? How do they achieve social status among their peers? And are there cognitive differences between them that might explain some of the disparities that we were seeing? I'm going to go over here and share my screen again, if I can. Here we go. Oops, wrong way. There we go. Now, what I just said might sound like massive stereotyping.
Sorry, we can't see your screen again.
What I just said might sound like massive stereotyping. So when I talk in generalities, I'll be using the phrase tend to, because while we can see significant patterns, they are by no means universal. In fact, when you're looking at girls and boys, what we see in the slide here is an image of overlapping Gaussian distributions. So you can see that there are more people represented at the peaks of these curves, but the distance between the peaks is less than the distance between the tails of a single curve. So that means that there's a smaller range of difference between the averages in both groups, boys and girls, than between the extremes in one group or the other. They're just more people at the middle of the curve. So in our secondary research, we learned that constructive play among boys tends to be based on physical environments that they create or repurpose, like building forts or ships. And among girls, constructive play was narrative rather than physical. That is, they play by making up stories, sometimes acting them out. Consider playing house. One young girl we talked to said, if a boy wants to play house, he will probably be the dog. Notice that the themes of play, constructive play between boys and girls, are also conforming to gender stereotypes that they may have learned as part of their socialization. Now, as regards cognition, evidence suggests that while girls tend to do better than boys at arithmetic, they tend to perform more poorly on tasks of mental rotation. That's like imagining something in a different aspect than it currently is, but only under time pressure. So if you remove time pressure, girls and boys perform equally well at mental rotation tasks. Now think about early computer games. They were side scrollers, which means that a girl, in order to gauge what action to take, had to do a mental rotation to pretend she was going in the direction that the game was scrolling in. And if she was working on a keyboard, there was also a translation from the plane of the keyboard to the plane of the screen. So cognitively, this was not good news, especially if you were on a clock. And this may also be why girls liked games like Sonic the Hedgehog and driving games, because they had a first-person view and didn't have to go through all those cognitive hoops. So I'm going to show you a series of slides now about competition. Let me see here. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go here. And I'm going to go there. Okay, so this is about how boys and girls have different styles of competition because it's a way of increasing their social status among their peer groups. So for example, boys have what we might call hierarchical social arrangements. This graph represents that in a very simplistic way. So direct competition and inheritance are the primary means of establishing social status. So for example, this boy wins, throws something farther, his social status is higher, and all the other boys that are affiliated with him are going to rise in the network as well. The other interesting thing is that boys don't tend to hold a grudge. One boy said to us, "I can kick your ass and it's no big deal. You know, we're friends again tomorrow." Now, girls, on the other hand, do things a little differently. They compete covertly. Again, there are social stereotypes at play here, like nice girls don't fight. They tend to organize themselves socially, not in terms of hierarchies, but rather in terms of networks of alliances. So the tools for competition become a little more complicated. So for example, you can advance your social status by, okay, let's start here. This girl is the queen bee. She has 3 connections, okay? If the girl next to her wants to improve her social status, she can reach out and make another connection. So this is called affiliation. And now you see the 2 girls have equal social status. Now, if you want to solidify your position as the second girl, I'm sorry. Oh, slides, don't you love them? You break a connection between that formerly popular girl and one of her friends. And this is called exclusion. It's not a pretty picture, but there it is. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. In our interviews, we learned a lot more about girls in particular, so their common problems and concerns. They had so much to say about difficulties in relationships and with social groups. Self-esteem as a function of beauty and a signifier of wealth was very important to them. And yeah, they delighted in nature, but in an interesting reversal from my own experience of nature as a childhood, where I wanted to take care of things and nurture them, the girls we interviewed wanted nature to take care of them with magic and secrets and special stories. And the lesson here is that although I was once a little girl, I could not have imagined that difference. And that's a good reason why, even though I thought I had a lot in common with my audience, I needed to go out and interview them. So these answers to questions about their concerns and their delights informed our designs, both in the play patterns, the game mechanics, and the designs of characters. So now I'll go back over and share my screen. There we go. So we designed games about how girls actually play. And they involve a cast of characters that's racially, economically, and emotionally diverse. So in a way, we stood up to that hegemonic Barbie stereotype, which enforces gender rules and body types and roles. And by the way, this is still true of Barbie today, but that's something else. Purple Moon succeeded in reaching the top 100 games. For both our first releases in 1997, we released 8 CD-ROM games, a website that was built from scratch, toys, cards, and books. So along the way, we learned some interesting things about recruiting kids for interviews. I learned about diet interviews from one of my colleagues, Christopher Ireland. And that means that you recruit one kid according to your research criteria like age, gender, region, etc. And then you ask that kid to bring their best friend with them. So you get a twofer. The kids probably have a lot of things in similar. They'll relate to each other during the interview, so you can learn things from what they have to say to one another. And sometimes they'll even correct one another if somebody makes an exaggeration or tells a fib. Now, these photos are from another research example that I'll touch on briefly. Back in 2005, my students at Art Center and I decided to take a look at how boys' notions of masculinity were influenced by media. So we interviewed dozens of boys aged 6 and 7 and asked their parents to keep media journals of what they were watching. And we learned that parents aren't very good at that. That's the advanced one. One of the most innovative things that the students did was in the way they represented their findings so that we could see patterns in the data. They built miniature bedrooms for each boy they'd interviewed, where the ceiling was hopes and dreams, the bedspread was heroes, the windows were desires, a wall represented media technology, and another wall represented fears. And students in the lower picture you can see also used props and collages as part of the display and highlighted pull quotes from the interviews. So among our findings were that parents aren't very good at tracking their son's media use. For example, one boy told us he sat and watched Lost every week with his mom. For those of you who have not seen this series, even my husband has problems with it. We learned that where many boys were drawn to roles like firemen, parents preferred them to aspire to safer roles like lawyer and accountant. Their fantasy heroes were characters from games or movies or TV shows. But when given the choice, almost all of these boys said they would rather play outside with their fathers than play video games or watch TV shows indoors. So this and other design research projects in the studio didn't just end with findings and analysis that came from models like this. The students went on to design products or systems that would make positive interventions in their audiences' lives. So after a whole lot of work, we discovered that boys learned that caring for the environment could be seen both positively by themselves and their parents. And so the students designed toys that invited collaboration among boys or between boys and their fathers that use clean energy sources like wind power and sun power to activate them. Another note I will share now. Am I sharing now? I am sharing now. Okay, on another note on methodology. If you can arrange to interview people in their homes, you're going to learn a lot more about them. A peek in the refrigerator or a shelf can speak volumes. At California College of the Arts, for example, in 2021, my graduate students and I were exploring green values and behaviors among adults in the San Francisco area. They learned about food deserts, and their learnings were profound. The little trucks that sold the same produce to every bodega along a street. The solutions that they came up with involved, among other things, a produce truck that could serve communities where the only available food sources were bodegas or fast food places. So now I want to turn the telescope around and look at stereotypes and biases we need to identify within ourselves and our own communities if we're to design for the good. So here's a personal example from the Purple Moon days. The studio we initially hired and who did the initial design of some of the games was about 85% female, which was great. But as time passed, we also learned that the majority of them were lesbian feminist separatists. And at one point when I hired a male producer, he was harassed. They thought he was straight. I went to talk to him. He was miserable. I said, well, you know, they have trouble with straight white men. And he said, oh, that means I can wear my earring now. He says that way they'll know I'm gay. So yeah, I'm going to share the screen again quickly. Toxic work environments are lousy for everybody. I think we know that. It took me a whole lot of years in my career to learn two important lessons. Rather than trying to be what I thought the guys or other people wanted me to be. I learned to be myself. I learned to be authentic. And I learned to listen to people rather than assuming that I knew what they were thinking or what they wanted. So a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of hosting a panel on these topics at the Interaction Design Conference, IXDA 21. The topic was how design communities can address social inequalities, racism, and homophobia. And the different panelists were representatives for different groups. So here's some quick background. Pablo Stanley is the founder of Blush. He advocates for Latinos and Latinas in design. Max Mazur is a trans man. He's a design strategist. He advocates for ethics and liberation of under-respected communities, and he's part of the Trans Justice Network. Mitzi Okwa is an associate producer at Spotify based in Stockholm. She's founder of the group Where Are the Black Designers? Rebecca Brooker is a queer Trinidadian designer currently based in Buenos Aires and founder of the Queer Design Club. And then there's me, the old white lady. So quickly, during the panel, I asked each of them, what makes a good ally? And I want to share with you some of their answers. Here they are, those lovely people. So a big message I got from Rebecca is that allies need to advocate for them in spaces where they don't have access. This means allies have to use their own privilege and resources to change minds and policies. But Mitzi pointed out that helping out can imply condescension. You poor thing, I'm going to help you out. So allies, for example, who give advice that isn't asked for, are acting like they know better or they're somehow superior. Max says, rather than calling people allies, think of them as accomplices. Mitzi went even farther to speak to the privilege of whites. She said, this is not our mess. You need to clean it up. You made it. And, you know, I see your point. There's a sort of blame the victim mentality that goes on in allyship and non-allyship that can make people very angry. And we have to be sure that we're taking responsibility for the problems that we cause. Pablo suggested it's a good idea to become an ally slowly, to begin by proactively changing things about inclusion in your own life. Look in the mirror for your own biases. Cultivate diverse friends. And Max reminded us that we have to speak out against the injustices and biases and stereotypes that we see. Self-inquiry is a necessary starting place. I've often used a ritual with research teams that seems to help. So I ask each person to write their biases and stereotypes about the work we're about to do on little slips of paper and then set them to one side before we start the work. And when the research is done, we come back and we look at those little slips of paper, and most of them are horrified by what they thought or knew before they went out and asked questions. And sometimes we burn the little slips of paper in my little cauldron just to be good and done with them. So I want to thank you very much for having me here today. I hope you took away something of value from this, and I'm so pleased to be part of your event. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenda. That was an amazing talk. It is eye-opening in terms of how we perceive stereotypes, and even though we believe to be allies to some people, there might be a wrong connotation on that. I see some questions in the chat, like people are asking, are there any tips for research methodologies to understand the kids' behaviors? So how do we plan for these?
Oh, wow. Excuse me. There are so many resources, from child psychology to scholars who study play. If you just, do some web searching, you're going to be able to find a whole lot of literature in a lot of different fields, including marketing. Looking at marketing literature about how to market to kids reveals so many horrifying stereotypes and manipulations. It's worth looking at that too. And I see another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, building on the same thing, we have another question asking about how we could change the narrative to be more constructive when we're talking about developing games for tomboys or girlish boys. This is again a marketing perspective in some ways, how we are trying to put people in a box and target them. So how do we do this?
One thing I'm proud of in Purple Moon is that the characters were so different. There were poor kids whose dads had left. There were kids whose mom had an alcohol problem. There were kids who were very snooty and high status. There were Black kids and Latino kids and white kids. We tried to include the tomboy types. Actually, my daughter played the character as one of the characters in our game. And we went on to do a final game about soccer that let some more tomboyish as well as girly stereotype people come in, and a lot of things in between. I think if you look at other kinds of games than the one I'm describing, the games that we did, for example, adventure games, online adventure games have always been popular with girls and women, and you can certainly pepper in characters and storylines that work for everybody. There are also gender neutral games, puzzle games, that are appealing to a larger swath of the audience. And today, of course, many, many more girls are just straight up action gamers. You know, they're going to play a shooter and love it. So times have changed. But being inclusive, I think, has to do with the play mechanics and the characters. Those are the most important things we can do. And there are I mean, at this point, the best independent games right now are being made by gay people, LGBTQ people, trans people, and a lot of them are gaining traction. So that's another place to look as you study how we can be more inclusive of the whole panoply of genders that live inside of a sex. Last time Rob and I counted, we thought there were about 28, but I bet there's more. Anyhow, I hope that helps.
Yes. So one last question here is, how can big corporations break these stereotypes? Because we believe the independent studios and it's a grassroots movement to have representation, but how do we affect this in a bigger way?
Well, I could mention a few things. When a female data scientist was fired from Google a couple of months ago for publishing a report on the way they were training their language models. Google employees rose up in large numbers. Now, she didn't get rehired because she didn't choose to go back. But employees taking notice, whether it's at Amazon or Google or Activision Blizzard, are going to make a difference in making the workplace more welcoming, more diverse, and more inclusive.
Okay. That's actually amazing to hear. It's heartwarming to know that even through some missteps and stumbles, we would be going towards the right direction and representing and empowering each other.
Well, you know, diverse staff makes diverse products. An inclusive company makes inclusive products. And at the end of the day, it makes good business sense for them to do so. They just sometimes don't know the mechanism, which is to diversify your workforce and be inclusive in the people that you bring in.
Yes, that makes quite a lot of sense. Okay, I guess that's it. So thanks a lot, Brenda, and thank you for opening us eyes to all of this. And we're glad to keep talking about this. So,
it's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you for being a part of this. And yeah, so we'll be heading on to the next talk.
Good. See you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.